Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar featuring the results of the International Drug Testing Survey. These results were originally presented this year at the IFDAC conference in Ireland, and AWSI wanted to give everyone who wasn't able to attend the opportunity to hear the results. Please also look for more AWSI webinar notifications in the new year as AWSI celebrates our 25th year anniversary. Now I would like to introduce to you today's presenter, Bill Current. Bill Current is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group. Current Consulting Group is a tenured team of employee screening experts who together offer a comprehensive and diverse lineup of consulting services. The Current Consulting Group team works with drug testing providers and other screening service companies to help them optimize profitability through the use of state-of-the-art operation systems and to increase their brand name recognition through increased traditional and social media exposure and educational events. Bill Current is the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He is also the author of 10 books on substance abuse prevention-related issues, including Why Drug Testing. He administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 16th year, and the International Drug Testing Trend Survey, now in its 2nd year. He is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education, was the first director of the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace, and served as vice president of consulting for Employee Information Services, a national third-party administrator of drug testing services. Please join me in welcoming Bill Current.
Well, thank you very much, Sammy, and it's a pleasure to be participating in today's webinar hosted by AWSI. And I'm looking forward to their series of webinars next year as well. As Sammy mentioned, we're going to be discussing the results of this year's international survey. And just to put that in perspective so you know exactly what we do with that. For the last 16 years, we've conducted a US-based survey of the drug testing industry. And it's been our pleasure each year to present the results of that survey at the annual SAPA conference. A couple of years ago, we decided that we would try an international survey, and we tried to mirror the format of the U.S. survey. In the U.S. survey, we will literally interview 20 to 30 people in the industry about drug testing trends, and then we'll send out an email survey to the SAPA membership of a couple where we'll typically get anywhere from 200 to 300 responses. And so it gives us a real good picture, a very accurate view of current trends and future trends, and we get ideas and quotes from the participants of the survey on how they're preparing for these trends, how they're reacting to it. Well, of course, an international survey is a much bigger project, a little bit more complicated. You could do a survey just on Germany or just on Great Britain, but what we try to do is capture providers internationally who actually conduct business in many different countries. So we may talk to a provider in Sweden who has operations throughout Europe, or a provider in Australia who also works in New Zealand. And so by talking to one person, we may be able to identify trends in several different countries. So in that regard, we don't need as many people to respond, but we still try to get as many as possible. And so for this year's survey, we had providers that represented these 19 different countries. Now, we do not, this year, unlike the first year that we did it in 2013, we don't have any representation from South America, Central America, but we do have Canada, of course. We exclude the U.S. providers, and these are just international-based providers. We do a separate survey of U.S.-based providers on their international drug testing operations. But what we're going to talk about today are the results of the survey of international-based providers, any provider outside the United States, but it's mostly, as you can see, in parts of the world other than South and Central America. And so these are the countries that were represented by the participants in this year's survey. And we asked them first to identify themselves. What services do you provide? And number one on the list were collections. So these are service providers who provide collection services first and foremost. They may provide those through a network that they're building of third-party collectors, and in many cases, they have their own facilities in different countries that they've opened up, and so their collection services actually represent their own company, or I should say their company-owned services. And that plays into a pretty significant part of the survey, as you're going to see several slides from now, when we ask about the status of collection services, the status of lab services in the countries where they do business. Interestingly enough, the number 2 service provided is alcohol testing. Now, when we do the U.S. survey, we also ask our participants to describe themselves by checking on the survey any boxes that apply, and then we have a whole list of services that they can choose from. And alcohol testing is typically not number 1 or number 2. It's a little bit lower on the list. A lot of U.S.-based providers, of course, provide alcohol testing services, but they wouldn't consider it a main part of their business. Not in all cases. But internationally, just the opposite, where it's collections first and then alcohol testing, followed by policy writing, which you would not find that in the U.S. either, so highly ranked, training for supervisors and employees, medical review, and then the number 1 category in the U.S. is actually the number 6 category internationally, which is third-party administrators. Laboratory services, number 7, and then distribution of drug testing products, number 8. Just a note on the concept of a third-party administrator from an international perspective. You know, we've been doing this in the United States for 30 to 40 years now, and we're still growing and emerging and evolving as an industry. For the most part, in countries outside the United States, it hasn't been a 30, 40-year venture yet. And so a lot of things are still in their infancy stage in many of these countries. And that's not to say that they're inferior by any means, but their definition of certain things, their outlook on certain things, actually not so much encumbered by 30 or 40 years of history as we have in the United States. For example, they're going to be more inclined to try alternative testing methods than perhaps we were 10, 15, 20 years ago in the United States, you know, sort of at the same point in our evolution as the international market is today. So third-party administrator, you know, in some places just doesn't actually meet the same definition that we use in the United States. And that may account for why it ranks lower in the international list than it does in the U.S. list, where it's always number 1 by a large margin. Now, these are the issues that were covered in the 2014 survey. Most of these, now that's not accurate, some of these are issues that we covered in the 2013 survey when we did our first one. And incidentally, we are going to do an international survey in 2015. We've already established that. AWSI has already agreed to sponsor next year's survey, and so we're grateful for that. We're looking forward to working with them again next year on the international survey. Some of these topics that were covered this year were covered last year, and I've got some slides that show comparisons. Some of these subjects in this year's survey are brand new. State of the drug testing industry outside the U.S., that's an overlapping between 2013 and 2014. The availability of quality of lab services and the availability and quality of collection services, those are new questions this year. So we don't have a comparison with last year, but we'll probably ask that question again in 2015 so we can start making comparisons. Keep in mind that in the U.S., of course, we've done this 16 years now. So we're able to compare, you know, the 2014 results with 2013, going all the way back to 2000 to actually 1999 when we did the first U.S.-based survey. But on the international side, we're still developing our history there. So some of these questions are new, as I mentioned. Those second and third bullet questions there are new this year. Testing with POCT devices, we do have comparison to last year to show you. And then trends regarding POCT, point of collection testing, oral fluid testing, and hair testing, we've got a little bit of comparison data that we can share. Urine versus oral fluid and hair testing, that's an interesting slide when I get to that one. And then we ask our survey participants to identify the industry's greatest challenges and then to predict emerging trends. And so that's what we'll conclude with when we get to that point. In 2013, we asked a question that we did not ask in 2014, so I want to go back a couple of years now to share this with you. In 2013, we asked the participants to identify the countries that they thought were best for drug testing. These are countries where the market for drug testing is at its best, healthiest if you're a provider. Well, everybody mentioned the United States, number one. Not everybody ranked it number one, but it ranked with the total points above all other countries. Then the United Kingdom, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, that's your top 5. Then Germany, Ireland, Canada, Singapore, Brazil, and Finland. What's interesting, I don't have a slide on this, but we also asked which were the countries that were worse for drug testing. And interestingly enough, the United States scored number 1 on that list. So half our audience last year ranked the U.S. number 1 for drug testing sales. Half of them thought it was the worst market for drug testing. Of course, it's a billion-dollar market in the United States and growing. But not everybody based internationally has an opportunity really to compete in the United States, and that sometimes will sort of paint their opinion. But last year, the U.S., the United Kingdom, Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand were the top 5 countries for drug testing according to our survey participants. And that's important to know because these are countries where, according to people who do business in these countries, where the market is healthy, it's growing. And I've got some slides coming up on that for sort of the state of the industry in 2014. Now, these are the nations that were represented in our survey, as I showed you earlier. But compare this map of the nations from this year's survey with the lists of states on the previous survey. Let me see if I can go back. So these are the best countries for drug testing according to our 2013 survey. And then you see a country like Germany, for example, ranked number 6 last year, and not among the countries that was represented in this year's survey. So we don't have a way to compare whether or not it's still a growing or healthy market for drug testing because it wasn't one of the countries where this year's providers actually provide their services. But some of them are overlapping. As I mentioned, you'll see to the far left there, the United States is not mentioned. It shows on the map, but the name is not there, and that means that we didn't include their data in this survey. We just wanted this year's survey to be just purely international in terms of countries outside of the United States. But a little bit of a comparison between the previous list of the countries that were best for drug testing and then the countries that were actually represented in this year's survey. In 2013, we also asked which markets within the workplace market, which markets were best or which industries were best for drug testing. No surprise, most of the markets that were identified were in the transportation industry. And you'll find that to be the case in the United States as well. Even though in the U.S., the percentage of all drug tests that are conducted, and I'm talking about workplace drug tests, the majority would be from the non-mandated, non-DOT mandated market. It's still a very influential and important part of the drug testing industry in the United States. Internationally, it's really where the action is. So people who identify transportation generally, almost 87%, but then oil and gas was number 2 after that. But then you had a subcategory aviation, 65%, railroad, 56%, go down a little bit to trucking, 43%, transit, 34%. And then you have some of the traditional markets that are woven into this list as well. You see construction there at almost 48%, police, law enforcement, and that's not law enforcement conducting tests, that's testing of police officers, also about 48%. And then manufacturing down there at the bottom, 30%. Manufacturing would traditionally score higher in the United States, a little bit lower in the U.S. Now, through IFDAT, there is an effort going forward to identify best practices in the oil and gas industry for drug testing internationally. And so there's a committee that within IFDAT that's working on that. And you can see why, because that's about 70% of those who participated and identified the market that, the industries, that are best for drug testing. Oil and gas scored number 2, second to transportation. In the United States, it would probably be, transportation wouldn't be as high, only because it's a smaller percentage of the overall pie in the United States. But as I said, it would still be an influential part of the industry here. but oil and gas would score very high. Construction would probably score higher in the United States than it does on this list, as would manufacturing. And all of these subcategories of transportation would be a little bit lower probably. Aviation, railroad, not as big a market for those in the United States. But again, part of the DOT regulations, so they're really on solid ground. But internationally, where it's not necessarily mandated, however it is in some countries, some transportation industries are mandated to do drug testing, as in Australia, for example. But you see that they still score very high. That's where the action is. That's where the sales opportunities exist in some of these subcategories of the transportation industry. So we didn't ask this question again in 2013. So I wanted to, in 2014, but I wanted to provide this information to you so you could get a comparison. In 2013, we also asked which are the drugs that are most commonly tested for as part of a drug testing panel. No surprise, marijuana, number one, 100%. Everybody said every drug test includes marijuana. That's an interesting point, which I've got a slide coming up on the whole issue of the legalization of marijuana. And I just did a webinar yesterday where we had nearly 500 people register, where we were talking just about marijuana and the status of legalized marijuana, legal in 23 states plus the District of Columbia in the United States. And on the ballot next week in the midterm elections, on the ballot in I think 5 or 6 different states. And it's not just medical marijuana, which is on the ballot here in Florida where I live, but it's the Colorado-Washington type of bills where it would be legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes in Alaska, Arizona, California, Oregon, and in the District of Columbia. The folks that are promoting the legalization of marijuana are pretty confident they're going to get some major victories next week. As somebody who opposes the legalization of marijuana personally, I hope that they're wrong, but we probably will see some states vote in favor of legalizing marijuana next week. Just have to wait and see. Internationally, 100% of the drug tests conducted for workplace drug testing include marijuana, even though in the U.S. we're seeing some employers pull back a little bit on that. That was a big question that we covered in the U.S. survey that we conducted this year. Opiates, 100% of the time. You're probably going to see that in the U.S. as well. The typical SAMHSA 5 drug test panel includes marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, and PCP. But internationally, they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a regulation that kind of establishes that standard 5 drug test panel. That's why you see at the very bottom PCP. But you also have prescription drugs lumped in together there. But only 8.6% of drug tests internationally include PCP, whereas in the United States, that would be every DOT test, for example, and many non-DOT tests, because a lot of non-mandated testing starts with that 5-panel test that's part of the SAMHSA regulations. Also, come down to the third one from the bottom, you've got synthetic drugs, specifically K2 spice, the synthetic cannabinoids, and bath salts, the substituted cathinones, 21%. I'm not sure it's close to 21% of all drug tests in the United States. It's a separate drug test, remember, so it's not actually adding K2 and spice to a drug test panel. It's a separate drug test. You're going to get charged separately for it. But it was one of the trends that was identified in this year's international survey as a growing problem. So not getting the headline attention that it was in the United States this year as it did last year, and especially in 2012, but still a growing problem, I think, in the United States, but not getting the attention that it did a couple of years ago, and perhaps starting to drop off the radar a little bit in terms of workplace drug testing. Internationally, just the opposite. A lot of concern expressed in this year's survey about synthetic drugs. We didn't ask this question again this year, but it was part of the when we asked about emerging trends and challenges. Now, let's go on to the 2014 survey results and comparing it to 2013. So one of the questions we always ask in the U.S. survey that we also ask in the international surveys, what's the state of the drug testing sales in the countries where you conduct business? And so the blue bar represents the 2013 result. The orange bar represents the 2014 result. 2013, blue, 2014, and orange. So those who said that they felt that that drug testing sales were growing substantially increased from 13% in 2013 to 30% in 2014. That's a healthy increase in terms of the percentage of participants that feel like drug testing sales are going up more than 5%. Growing slightly, much higher last year than this year, and then flat or about the same as last year at 27% in 2013. Felt like things were the same as the year before, 2012. This year, a little bit more, 40%, indicating that it was about the same as 2013. So essentially what we're learning from this particular question is that drug testing sales internationally, at least in the countries that were identified as part of this year's survey, are holding ground, in some cases up slightly, and in some cases up substantially. So we can gather from this that the international market, at least in these countries, most of them are in Europe, is on the upswing. Compared to 2013, compared to 2012, if we looked at that data, we would see that it's at least a slight increase. And where is it actually happening? Well, according to the participants in this year's survey, the countries where they do business, where they're seeing sales going up more than 5% are New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Turkey, and Romania. Now, you might have a provider in participating in our survey, more than one provider in our survey from Sweden. One may feel like it's up more than 5% because his sales are up more than 5%. In another country, you might have a provider where her sales are down or they're flat. And so you can see countries appear on both the up 5% or more than 5%, and then the ones that are just sort of moving up at a snail's pace, but they're still going up. We tried to take that into account when we put our figures together. The countries where the providers felt like it was up between 1% and 5%, the United Kingdom, Ghana, Indonesia, United Arab Emirate, and Canada, and Austria. And we didn't have Austria in last year's survey, so we don't have anything to compare that by. Canada, very much, the oil and gas industry is sort of the driving factor there in Canada in terms of drug testing sales. Not so much so in the United Kingdom in particular. So, but still, nonetheless, these are countries where drug testing sales are increasing. Now, we asked specifically about point of collection testing. And this is an interesting question to look at internationally because in the United States, POCT, whether you're going to call it rapid result, instant results, on-site testing, which was sort of the name back in 20 years ago. We're seeing, if you look at our U.S. survey, you're seeing that it's sort of leveled off a little bit. It's sort of found its place in the drug testing industry and in the markets where it's caught on. Not a lot of growth still happening on the POCT side. That's not to say it's stuck there. I think there's a lot of potential personally with POCT testing. But internationally, we're still looking at a sort of a newer industry for drug testing. And so they're not encumbered by DOT regulations in the U.S. that don't allow POCT and therefore sort of taint the value or the benefits of POCT in the minds of some potential buyers and certainly among some potential sellers of POCT. And yet their opinion is still growing. It's still maturing. So companies that use POCT but still use a professional collector, not very high, about 20%. In our survey in 2013 here in the United States, we asked that question of your clients that use POCT devices, point of collection testing devices, how many of them still use professional collectors to administer the test? And the vast majority of people said it was 80% or higher. So one of the values or perceived values of POCT is to get that instant result, of course, but a lot of employers like that. They still don't want to conduct or administer the test themselves or have their employees do it, so they still use professional collectors. Outside of the United States, just the opposite. About 20% of companies that use POCT use professional collectors. What's the perceived quality of these devices? Is it not as good as lab testing? That's about half of the people. And that's interesting because in the United States, I think we probably started high on that question, but now it's come down as the quality of POCT testing and the devices using FDA-cleared devices, et cetera, has started to improve the sort of brand name recognition of POCT, generally speaking. Is POCT urine more popular than POCT oral fluid? Sort of, right around 30%, not a big move. In the U.S., it would be a much higher percentage, I think, of people who would say that. agree with that statement. Prefer POCT over lab testing? Not so much. About 20% prefer lab testing over POCT. About half the participants, again, saying that lab-based testing would probably still be preferred over POCT. And then the last statement, POCT is still relatively new. Yeah, about 20%. It doesn't seem to have quite the attention internationally. I think there's still a lot of development going on in terms of, sort of understanding the options that are available. But I think there's still potential internationally for POCT, especially in markets where it's very, very challenging to find quality collection services. And I've got some slides coming up on collection services that I'll share with you in a moment. These were some of the comments that were provided by our survey participants. One talking about the UK, US, and Australia. Kind of hard to lump the US in with those two countries, but identifying issues with cutoff levels, cross-reactivity, sort of shelf life and running out of shelf life before you can use a product, an issue identified by this one individual. In Finland, there are no POCT used, and I'm just quoting from the comments that were provided, for workplace drug testing. It might be very difficult to get accreditation for them in Finland. POCT testing very popular in New Zealand for urine testing, and there are a number of on-site devices, POCT devices, which have been verified as complying with the law there in New Zealand. That's interesting. That'd be kind of sort of the equivalent of an FDA clearance. And in the U.S., we've asked that question before: how important is FDA clearance in the use of a POCT device to your clients? And drug testing providers will, in very large numbers, very high percentages, indicate that FDA clearance is very important. They won't sell a device in many cases that are not FDA cleared, especially in urine. On the POCT oral fluid side, that's a different ballgame altogether because there's really only one FDA cleared device. And if you're using it in non-workplace markets, it's not as much of a decision factor there. Rapid result testing is not used in workplace testing for legal reasons, according to one of our participants, but very popular in what they call abuse clinics or treatment clinics. POCT or rapid testing is, and then I had to bleep out that word there. Only laboratory results produce reliable results, according to this one person. And you still find people in the United States who have that opinion. It is available, but we have not tried to import or export POCT devices. Point of collection tests in the United States. Remember, I told you we asked that question here in our U.S. survey. What percentage of all drug tests are point of collection tests? 5% or less? 4.2% of our respondents. Between 5 and 10%? 12.5%. Between 10 and 15? Almost 10%. Between 15 and 20? About 21%. And more than 20%? 33.8%. Now, 18% admitted they don't really know, but 42% said that POCT sales are up in 2014 compared to 2013. So probably, maybe a little bit more of a solid foundation for POCT testing in the United States. Less than half the people in the survey indicated sales were up. They didn't say by how much or compared to what. Well, actually, it was compared to 2013. But as personal opinion, I believe that POCT will continue to grow in popularity in the U.S. in certain markets where it's really sort of found a niche. Internationally, still a ways to go in terms of developing that public opinion of it. Now, we also asked internationally on oral fluid testing, and we have long held the opinion at Current Consulting Group that oral fluid testing perhaps has greater potential in international markets than in the U.S. because, again, internationally not sort of encumbered by the DOT regulations. Well, of course, our opinion on that has changed here in the United States because the federal government, SAMHSA, is in the process of developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. Not POCT oral fluid, just lab-based oral fluid testing. But when that happens and it becomes part of Part 40, then you'll see a lot more companies, I think, adopting lab-based oral fluid testing because some of the inherent benefits of it, the ability of, to be able to do collections on site, not have to deal with off-site professional collectors, the not having to deal with urine, the difficulty in cheating on an oral fluid test, et cetera. These are all among the benefits we've talked about many times. Internationally, it's still an emerging part of the drug testing world outside the United States. In the U.S., I think those SAMHSA guidelines, when they come out, are going to have a big impact on lab-based oral fluid sales, and DOT has signaled already publicly that when those SAMHSA guidelines come out, they will start the process to eventually allow lab-based oral fluid testing under the DOT regulations. And you'll also see a lot of states in the U.S. doing the same thing, because there are many states, I shouldn't say many, but there's a good, healthy handful of states that have sort of punted on the whole issue of drug testing procedures as part of their state drug testing laws, and they defer simply to Part 40 or to the SAMHSA guidelines, SAMHSA regulations, however they word it. And so once that happens at the federal level, a lot of these state laws will automatically, de facto, allow lab-based oral fluid testing. Most of them don't disallow it now, but it will be part of their drug testing law. And this would be the case even in those states with voluntary laws, like here in Florida, Tennessee, Ohio. Ohio being a good one, because they do punt on the whole issue of procedures and they defer to the SAMHSA regulations. Internationally, still some ground to make up there. Now, as I go through, I should have mentioned this under POCT, but before I say anything about the oral fluid slide here, the European Workplace Drug Testing Society, EWDTS, which works in concert with IFDAT and vice versa, they're on friendly terms, but they have developed guidelines for lab-based urine testing, oral fluid testing, hair testing. They're not nearly as detailed as we would expect to see here in the United States. It's a good starting point, but it creates this impression that these are legitimate, viable alternatives to choose from. You don't necessarily have to do urine testing. We've got guidelines, EWDTS has guidelines for oral fluid testing as well as hair testing. Some countries don't allow some of these alternatives, but nonetheless, it's still worth looking into. As a provider, I recommend oral fluid testing. That's what that first line should say there. And you can see that's all the way over to the 50% side of the chart. So a growing number, a healthy number of international providers are actually recommending oral fluid testing. Second one, oral fluid testing not as accurate as urine. Not a whole lot of people hold that opinion, less than 20%. Those that use oral fluid use POCT oral fluid, not very much, less than 10%. Those that use oral fluid use lab-based oral fluid testing, just the opposite, about 40%. Generally, employers prefer oral fluid testing over urine, not a lot. Generally, employers do not like oral fluid testing. That's a pretty high percentage of individuals who agreed with that statement, and so there's still a lot of room to grow there internationally. When you compare it to the United States, like the chart that we showed for POCT, still a lot of room for growth here in the U.S. as well. Again, when those SAMHSA guidelines come out, I think we'll see a change, a paradigm shift, but that hasn't happened yet. And so while these numbers are probably a significant improvement over 10 years ago, they're still not, by any means comparable to what we see with lab-based urine testing. 5% or less agreed with that, 25% agreed with that, I should say. Between 5 and 10%, almost 30% agreed with that. Between 10 and 15, 9.8. Between 15 and 20%, 8.4. More than 20%, less than 3%. Now remember, with POC testing, that chart I showed you, that's where, there was a pretty healthy number there. And oral fluid sales up in 2014 compared to 2013, about 37%, indicating an increase in oral fluid testing sales here in the United States. Probably wouldn't see that on the international side yet, and this is a good sign for the oral fluid testing people, because these regulations haven't come out from the federal government yet, but it's starting to generate some buzz. People are looking into it. A lot of providers in the U.S. telling me that they're having their clients are actually coming to them inquiring. And so once the market starts to drive the industry instead of the other way around, then you really see some growth in sales. And so that's in part starting to happen. We also asked about hair testing. As a provider, I recommend hair testing. This is on the international side. Not very many. Hair testing is not as accurate as urine testing. Again, not that many people agreed with that statement. Generally, employers prefer hair testing. No, not so much. Generally, employers do not like hair testing. A lot of people agreed with that statement. And that's, again, sort of indicative of the fact that the industry and the market for workplace drug testing internationally is still growing. It's still emerging. Hair testing catching on. In Brazil, very, very popular as a result of some laws that have been passed in Brazil, making hair testing mandatory in certain situations. And so we're going to see hair testing, I think, increase in popularity internationally, but it's still a very sort of immature market in its infancy. And so a lot more education needs to take place, I think, with hair testing, even more so than with oral fluid testing. In the U.S., fairly healthy. 5% or less, 35% of people agreed with that. Between 5 and 10, almost 31. Then it starts to drop off a little bit, kind of like oral fluid testing did. Between 10 and 15%, only 7% of people agreed with that. Between 15 and 20%, 7% of people. More than 20, only 2.8. And if you go down to the last line, hair testing sales are up. Again, we're seeing growth in the United States, 37.8%. A lot of that in the U.S. is being driven by the trucking industry, right? And if you're in the trucking industry on today's webinar, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, you may be confused, right? Because the trucking industry falls under the DOT regulations, and DOT only allows lab-based urine testing. Well, a lot of big trucking companies are also under separate company authority conducting pre-employment testing with hair, in addition to collecting a urine sample. So they're complying with the DOT regulations, but they're also doing hair tests. Well, why would they do that? Well, as you probably know, the window of detection is one of the key differentiators for hair testing compared to urine testing. The window of detection at the cutoff levels that we typically use for urine testing through a laboratory is only about 3 to 4 days. With hair testing, it goes up to about 90 days. Now, one catch there. The window of detection for hair testing doesn't start until about 7 days after the person used the drug. So if they're a casual user and they're not constantly using the drug, then it's going to take about a week before that drug starts to show up in those hair follicles. But it's going to stay detectable in the hair for up to 90 days. It gives you a much broader, wider window of detection than with any other testing method. And that's important in the trucking industry. A lot of other industries, maybe not so much, or at least not yet, as it has not caught on in some industries like retail, for example. But it could be something that they become interested in, certainly in safety-sensitive industries where those hiring decisions could be influenced by, a bigger, wider view into the lifestyle of that job applicant. Still a ways to go internationally, though. In the U.S., starting to pick up and finding a niche, especially in the trucking industry. Now, this is a comparison of urine versus oral fluid in hair. So we saw what the respondents had to say in terms of where they think things are. But in reality, how many of your drug tests that you conduct are urine versus oral fluid versus hair? So one provider who does business in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland said 80% of his company's drug tests are urine tests. And almost all of that's lab-based urine testing. 15%, which I thought was pretty healthy, was oral fluid testing, only 5% hair testing. Another survey participant, also in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Estonia, said only 65% of his company's drug tests are urine. 35%, a very, very healthy number, percentage, are oral fluid, only about 1%. Barely 1%, less than 1% if you add up those percentages across the line there, hair testing. Another provider only doing business in Finland, all of his or her tests are urine tests. Another one from New Zealand, the vast majority, 90% urine, about 10% oral fluid, less than a percentage hair testing. Again, Sweden, 99.9% urine. Austria, 96% urine, 2% oral fluid. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway from another provider, and I just picked out some samples here, 90% urine, 10% oral fluid. And then another provider doing business in Canada, Ireland, Poland, the Philippines, and India, almost all, 95% urine testing. And so this is really where the rubber meets the road, right? This is what, on those other slides, these are our opinions. This is where we think we're going. This is what we think our clients want or what they think about different testing methods. But when you get right down to it, the vast majority of drug tests, in almost every instance except that second one, if you want to sort of exclude that one, 80% or higher, most of them around 90% or higher urine testing still. So that's where the market is for drug testing right now in these countries. Now, we did ask questions about laboratory services. And so one provider who does business in these countries, the UK, Indonesia, Australia, the UAE, and Ghana, said very suitable lab services in all except the UK. Interesting. I would have thought it might be the other way around. Indonesia looks to send to Australia. UAE and Ghana use the UK. All outside the UK consider point of contact essential. Also, as for lab standards and accreditation, there is a lack of knowledge of what to ask the labs to see if accredited. Many cannot analyze for workplace drug test samples. So this is something I think we all knew, which is that the laboratory side of the industry outside the U.S. still growing, still emerging, still a lot to see develop there still, but starting to make some progress, and something that companies are looking for. Here's another provider doing business in these countries. Actually, these are not one provider, but these are quotes from several providers that do business in these countries. A very few competent labs readily available in Sweden. That's one person's opinion. Excuse me. Full service available in Sweden serves the rest of Scandinavia. So another provider really sort of saying the opposite about Sweden. A very few competent labs in Norway. A few screening labs in Finland, and to our knowledge, only one lab for screening and verification both. We use domestic laboratories in Sweden and ship sometimes, especially hair tests, outside Sweden. And then labs we use in Sweden, Norway, Turkey, France, Romania are competent and have the accreditation certification that we request. Basically, from many of these providers, yes, there's still a lot to be desired, but they're able to get their work done. In New Zealand, Canada, and Ireland, participants said New Zealand has 2 accredited laboratories which provide very good, competent analytical services. And one provider said, not sure that the European laboratories use chain of custody standards. They have different drug panel configurations and use some different cutoff levels. That's important, right? In the United States, a lot of laboratories are automatically going to use those SAMHSA cutoff levels, and that sort of is the standard. It becomes something that even state laws adopt. But outside the United States and some countries, you've got to check. You've got to make sure that the labs you're doing business with are using the cutoff levels that you want. Now, we know that a lot of U.S.-based companies conducting drug tests in other parts of the world will require their provider to ship the urine sample to a laboratory in the United States. I don't know if I should say a lot, but we know that happens. And sometimes that can be a challenge, shipping a urine sample out of a country. But there is a growing network of laboratories, especially in Europe, that can provide these services. And in places like New Zealand and Australia, for example, where the drug testing industry is maturing maybe even faster in those countries than in parts of Europe and South America. But a lot of companies still revert to using U.S.-based laboratories and having those samples shipped clear across the world. Collection services, a different ballgame. In the United Kingdom, Indonesia, Australia, UAE, and Ghana, quote, sample collections can be a challenge, especially if a national is collecting from a national, okay? Tribal and emotional pressure is applied. Sometimes the collector is an expat, but a guest in the country, and the donor is a national with influence. Again, not ideal. I don't run into that so much in the United States. All collectors are trained, but may not get the necessary amount of practice. That was something I did an entire webinar on international collections earlier this year. That was one of the big problems. You can train people, but if there's not enough business for them to really get the experience, then it's kind of like training them over and over again. In Finland, Norway, Sweden, Scandinavia, France, Turkey, and Romania, and I'm going to kind of brush through some of these because we're getting a little bit tight on time, and I've got a few more slides to share with you. In Sweden and Norway, good competence for collectors. One person saying we provide collection services through our own network of collectors, and that's what a lot of companies, even the U.S., have resorted to doing, is creating their own network of collectors because they can really rely on those services better that way. Collectors are sent out to conduct collections on site. this one person said. International collections are many times difficult and errors can occur. We see that in the U.S. also. But he goes on to say it is because of low volume. Our company has also a medical center located in the center of Helsinki, and we have collection services there. And in Finland, the collectors have to be healthcare professionals by law. We also train our customers to take the samples. So a little bit of a wrinkle there compared to the U.S. In New Zealand, Canada, and Ireland, there are many collecting agents throughout New Zealand who have staff certified to conduct both urine collections and drug screening in compliance with the law. Some companies train their own employees to be able to do it. Some collecting agencies also offer oral fluid specimen collection. And then another one saying we are a laboratory and provide collection services. And so they're able to do both, and sometimes that makes providing the service a little bit easier to do. And these are kind of some similar statements here. Let me go on to the next slide. The legalization of marijuana, I promised to tell you a little bit about that. Of course, if you're here in the United States, you know that next week there are a number of states that are going to be voting on legalizing marijuana either for medicinal or recreational use. I asked this question of our international survey participants, thinking it would be a hot topic internationally. But basically what I said can be summarized in, it's not a problem where we do business. The countries where we do business, quote unquote, are not interested in legalizing marijuana. We don't really see that happening, except, as one person said, and except if the United States legalizes the drug, then it will have an influence on the countries where we do business. Well, you can see where they're watching very carefully what's happening in the United States. It's kind of like states in the U.S. that are watching the trends in the states around them. For example, in Idaho, marijuana is not legal, but it is legal in Oregon, it is legal in Washington, it is legal in Colorado. These are states right around Idaho, and Idaho legislators actually passed a resolution, not a law, not a binding law of anything, essentially just saying we don't appreciate that our neighboring states have legalized marijuana, and legal marijuana in your state is actually having a negative impact here in Idaho. Well, the same is happening internationally, where providers of drug testing services are watching very carefully what we do in the United States, because what we do could eventually create a trend in their countries that currently does not exist. And I would have thought that would not necessarily be the case, because we know that in some European countries, marijuana is legal, but not in most of these countries. And I really got the impression in talking to these people that they didn't appreciate what was going on in the United States. An interesting angle to the whole marijuana issue. And this is basically kind of what I just summarized for you. On the marijuana side, I should say here in the United States, most providers are starting to see clients ask about whether or not they can still test for marijuana here in the United States because of these legalized issues in some states. Not so much a concern yet internationally. Now, when we asked about concerns about drug testing from an international perspective, from the UK, the need for appropriate confirmation services, lack of understanding among service providers. See, still, a lot of this points to education, which we have many different outlets for here in the United States, just like this AWSI webinar today. Things that come from SAPA and DAISHA. Things that are starting to come from IFDAT are tremendous value to international providers. And so there's a lot of education that still needs to take place to start to develop best practices that are observed from country to country. And so a lot of these statements kind of reflect that. In Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Estonia, Finland, workers' unions are a big problem that are hurting the further development and maturing of the drug testing industry. Psychoactive substances, I heard that from a number of people. Just put this one in here from Finland. Companies are not willing to pay so much for the analytics, meaning the drug tests. If you're in the drug testing business in the U.S., you know it's very price-driven, especially in certain markets like staffing. From New Zealand, most testing panels are not including the new designer drugs, the synthetic cannabinoids and the party drugs. So that's an issue. It's an issue in the U.S., as I mentioned before, but something of great concern internationally. In New Zealand, it's difficult to get drug testing services in certain parts of the world, like China, for example. From Austria, U.S. manufacturers, now you kind of get a feel for who's using the bleeping words that I have to cut out. U.S. manufacturers for drug testing assays are too expletive to understand European needs for drug testing. For example, typical U.S. workplace positivity rates, around 2% of the samples. It's actually higher than that, but not a lot higher than that. Positivity rates of our samples is around 57%, but this is somebody that's working in the treatment industry. So you do get higher positivity rates here in the U.S. also in the treatment industry, and for certain types of workplace drug testing, right? Reasonable suspicion will typically have about a 25 to 30% positivity rate, whereas pre-employment testing, random testing will be much lower than 4 or 5. They'll be 4 or 5%, maybe a little lower, depends on where in the country you're and what industries you're testing in. So kind of take that statement from Austria with a little bit of a grain of salt. From Sweden, Scandinavia is still a developing market, especially Norway and Denmark, so a lot of education still needed there. In Sweden, unlikely that test results from other countries will have any legal significance. That's of importance there. Violation of privacy laws and local laws or labor agreements, a big issue in many countries. Privacy laws play a great part, big influential part in drug testing outside the United States. And then from Canada, you need to pay attention to the drugs that are being abused and be sure to comply with all privacy laws. That is an issue here in the United States also. Not the privacy laws so much. We've kind of made our peace with that part of the whole issue, but you know, are we testing for the drugs that people are actually using? Predictions. The Australian Oral Fluid Standard has been approved for updating during 2015, and we will become a joint ASNZS standard, Australia, New Zealand. This is likely to result in an increase of oral fluid versus urine testing methodologies in New Zealand, provided more sensitive POCT devices can be manufactured. Interesting observation there. Accreditation for providing oral fluid testing services. Remember, earlier I said oral fluid has a lot of potential internationally, and a lot of international providers are looking at oral fluid testing very seriously. The last bullet there, the mix of drugs of abuse becomes increasingly diverse and complex, and if the laboratories can provide reporting times of less than 24 hours, there will be a move back to lab testing as opposed to POCT. Yeah, interesting prediction there. Oral fluid testing will become dominant if assay manufacturers will provide tests that meet relevant cutoffs. In the U.S., we've got that with lab-based testing. That's why SAMHSA is moving to develop regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. Fast, cheap immunological screening tests for new psychoactive substances, referring mostly to like synthetic cannabinoids, for example, in reading more of the information that was provided in these comments. In the U.S., of course, that's a more expensive test, and so it does sort of tamp down a little bit the percentage of employers that are willing to test for those substances. So a fast, cheaper screening test would be a benefit. And then finally, I think that international guidelines for contractors within the oil and gas industry will have a big impact. I shouldn't say big. Will have an impact on drug testing internationally. And the individual says, I hope it comes in place soon. And that's something that's happening through IFDAT, something that AWSI is involved in, I know, in helping to develop certain standards or best practices in the oil and gas industry for international. And that will have an impact in the very same way that the DOT regulations have an impact here in the United States. It will have an impact internationally once the oil and gas industry, which is such a dominant part of drug testing in the international market, once the industry sort of determines some best practices that they can all agree on, then I think you'll see drug testing overall start to increase as those standards take place and establish more of a comfort level among providers and employers and buyers. So with that, let's go to some questions. And as we launch into the questions, and we just have a few minutes left, but let me answer a couple of questions for you that we have. But first, let me say that if you're interested in joining AWSI as the sponsor of next year's 2015 International Drug Testing Survey, please, just email me at info@currentconsultinggroup.com or give us a call at our main number there, and we'd be happy to give you some information on how you can do that. We very much appreciate AWSI's support of the international survey. The information, I think, is valuable. It's much needed right now as the international markets continues to mature and evolve, and some of the information that we get from that is very, very important. One question that we have here, what about legal information for drug testing outside of the United States? That's a good question, because in the United States we have all these different state laws, and we have the federal regulations, of course. But outside of the federal regulations, drug testing is governed mostly by state laws or by case law. So, for example, here in Florida we have a voluntary law. If you want to do drug testing in compliance with our voluntary law here in Florida, you could qualify for a 5% discount in your workers' compensation premiums. In another state like Minnesota, it has a mandatory drug testing law. If you do drug testing in the workplace in Minnesota, you must comply with the Minnesota statute. And then in other states like California, Massachusetts, you don't necessarily have a statute, but you have a lot of case law. Internationally, we're looking at a number of different things. First, we're looking to see if there is a law for that country. And some countries do have something like a drug testing law. But many of them have either national labor agreements, they have privacy laws, they have health codes that all combine, and they all sort of combine to create a legal atmosphere for drug testing in that country. And the privacy laws play a big role in international drug testing, especially in Europe, as well as the labor agreements. So you can have national labor agreements that will have a direct impact on an employer's ability to do drug testing of employees. May not cover pre-employment testing, but it often will have a big impact on employee drug testing. In Canada, for example, you're going to look at the issue on a province-by-province basis, but a big factor in how you do your workplace drug testing in Canada will be determined by the labor agreement that is in place and applies in that province. So, Quebec might be a little bit more lenient, whereas Ontario is much more strict and narrow in terms of what you can do. And that's because of these labor agreements that exist in each of the different provinces. In Canada, it's a little bit more like the United States, but in the U.S. it's not driven by labor agreements as much as by state laws. In Canada, it's labor agreements, and in many parts of Europe and in other parts of the world as well, it's labor agreements, it's privacy laws, and it's health codes. When you're looking at what you can do in Finland, what you can do in Germany, what you can do in Great Britain, et cetera, you have to look at the diversity of laws and regulations that all have an impact on drug testing. And we can provide that kind of information on a country-by-country basis if you have specific questions. I just see it as a general question here. The other thing to keep in mind with Europe, just let me say real quickly, is that you have those sort of best practice guidelines that are available from the European Workplace Drug Testing Society, so the EWDTS. And some countries are looking at those guidelines as sort of almost a mandatory way to do drug testing. It's not actually that, but it provides that potential. But international drug testing law, a very interesting comparison to the United States. And as I say, you've got to look at all of those things. I have another question here about, do I need a drug testing policy, or can I just use my U.S. policy in other countries? And I would advise just using a U.S. policy. I would advise against using a U.S. policy sort of straight across. You just run into so many variables. It's just like having a policy in the United States. You've got to make sure that your U.S. policy is compliant with all the different state laws that apply to your company. Same is true with an international company. If you're in many different countries, you really have to have a policy that is compliant with each of those countries' various privacy laws, labor agreements, et cetera. And so I would advise having a policy that is maybe a separate policy for each of the countries, or putting together a policy that complies with many of the countries' legal requirements, but then being able to maybe add amendments or addendums to the policy to cover different issues that come up. But you definitely need a policy internationally, and I would advise against just trying to use a U.S. policy for your international drug testing program. I can see we're out of time. If you have any other questions, please email me. If you want to email me directly at bill@billcurrent.com, I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thanks again to AWSI for hosting today's